In the light of Sri Aurobindo's 150th birth anniversary celebrations, we begin the book journey of reading Sri Aurobindo in the very town the poet, philosopher, yogi chose as the physical abode of his sadhana. We invite the editors Gautam Chikarmane and Devdip Ganguli and their publisher Milee Ashwarya to tell us more about the book. Gautam Chikarmane is Vice President at Observer Research Foundation. His areas of research are economics, politics, foreign policy, and the Mahabharata. Earlier, he has held leadership positions in some of India's top newspapers and magazines, including Hindustan Times, the Indian Express, and the Financial Express. Devdip Ganguli teaches undergraduate students at the Sri Aurobindo International Center of Education, Pondicherry, where he offers courses on the social and political philosophy of Sri Aurobindo, as well as on ancient Indian history, art, and culture. He is frequently invited to speak in universities in India and abroad on topics related to Sri Aurobindo's writings. Milee Ashwarya is the editor-in-chief for commercial and business books and the backlist publisher at Penguin Random House, India. She completed her BA and MA English from the esteemed Hindu College, Delhi University. In more than a decade-long career in publishing, Milee Ashwarya has been responsible for establishing and spearheading the local publishing list, first at Random House India and now at Penguin Random House India. A TEDx speaker, Milee has been invited to speak at various book festivals and platforms such as AdTech, Ideas India Conclave, IPPO Conference, the IITs, and IIM. She was recently awarded the Women Achievers Samman 2017 for publishing by the Global Organization of People of Indian Origin, GOPIO, and NRI Achievers. Gautam Chikarmane and Devdip Ganguli, in conversation with Milee Ashwarya, will now speak on reading Sri Aurobindo.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here amidst all of you and also in Pondicherry. It's my first time here, and what has drawn me is Sri Aurobindo. So, and the book that we published, Reading Sri Aurobindo, edited by Gautam Chikarmane and Devdip Ganguli. It's been a very special journey for me too, working on the book with both Devdip and Gautam, and I'm so happy that we're able to publish it in time for Sri Aurobindo's 150th birth anniversary. So thank you again for joining us here on this Sunday morning, and we will get into the book straight away. I'll start with you, Devdip. Like I said, it is the 150th birth anniversary of Sri Aurobindo. So what is the significance of, publishing the book and bringing it out now?
Good morning. So on 15th August 1947, Sri Aurobindo was 75 years old. And at that point of time, he had issued a message to the All India Radio where he speaks about his 5 dreams. And 75 years later, as we are celebrating his 150th birth anniversary, this is a good time to reflect on how far we have come and how far we need to go. The significance of reading Sri Aurobindo is essentially to direct our attention once again to his essential teachings through his texts. So we have, of course, Sri Aurobindo is a nationally, internationally known figure. But what we want to do through this book is to highlight that he cannot be restricted to any narrow paradigm. He is a vast, his teaching, his writings, they are vast, and we must engage with them increasingly, not through any limited prism, but in their entirety. So that is what we have attempted to do through the book. And I might add that it is also significant that Penguin agreed and has supported this publication because we have not shied away from presenting Sri Aurobindo in his entirety. We are not focusing only on his nationalist period or his political period, which is of course significant and important. But we have given equal stress to, or even more stress to, the work that he did subsequently. And if you open the book and the introduction written by Gautam, is Sri Aurobindo, the supramental sage, which is also the subtitle in our jacket. And that is what we want to highlight, that he belongs to the future, which is calling us to grow towards, and his texts and writings are the means by which we can walk that path. Maybe Gautam would like to add to that if he...
Sure.
Got it. No, Devdip, I think you have done a fine job of introducing. I have nothing more to add. Maybe further in the conversation, except the fact that I'm terrified right now. At least half the people in the audience, I know them personally, and I'm just wondering whether they'll get out of here with some learnings or laughter.
Both, hopefully.
No, absolutely. I think, it's the kind of audience we want for the book, so known faces and some new faces as well. And I hope you all will be tempted to read the book. Gautam, tell us a bit about, how the idea for the book originated and took shape.
Okay, so the 150th birth anniversary was on its way, and I was thinking about what to do. For a long time, I had been wanting to write on Sri Aurobindo, didn't have the courage. And I thought that maybe this is a time to start engaging formally. I mean, it's one thing to read Sri Aurobindo, and it's another thing to write reading Sri Aurobindo. I realized later that actually this idea is not my own, and if some of you who have engaged with Sri Aurobindo, you will understand when I say that some of the ideas come to you from outside and some from within. This one came from outside. How it came, when it came, I don't remember. But it was like a seed that got in there and then went down here into my heart. And then I began to think about this book. And I thought that, let me read all the 36 volumes and write this book. And those of you who are conversant with Sri Aurobindo's writings know that that is an impossible task. It would take 2 or 3 lifetimes to read any or all these books in the manner that they ought to be read. So then I thought that, no, I think I'm not going to be greedy. And then I leaned on Devdip that let us do the book. And then we thought that, no, even that is not enough. I mean, who can, in this audience, many of you have read The Life Divine. How many of you are confident enough to say, yeah, I know Life Divine? Nobody. And so then we opened it out further. And then we invited people who have actually specialized in certain books, read them, engaged with those ideas, perhaps even changed them. Because when you read Sri Aurobindo, whatever goes into the mental part goes, but you change as a person. Writing this book, editing this book, I had to revisit several of the books that I had read earlier through the eyes of some of the authors. And I found new revelations there. If I read this book 2 years later, there will be newer revelations. And that's what Sri Aurobindo is. As you evolve, you grow with his writing, the writing grows on you, you become one. You try to engage with the symbolism of words and ideas, but at some point it comes down here and sits in you, and one day you just realize that you've been transformed, not in the supramental manner, but in your approach to life. Like I can see as I'm a writer, my writings of 10 years ago and today are vastly different. Part of it is because of the jobs, but a deeper aspect in my writing is definitely Sri Aurobindo's writing. So we got the authors together. Some of them are here, and we are very grateful to them. Some authors are so good that whenever we got trapped, we had to drag them. Richard is one of them there. He has written 4 chapters. Sampadananji is here. And one by one, all of them are titans in the books that they read, in the books of Sri Aurobindo that they have read. And yet, they were open to our editing, our suggestions, the changes that we made at the first level, and then Milee's team at the second level. And it's been a good process. Let me also let you in on a secret. Everybody who has engaged with this book, apart from us, as in the editors at Penguin, Milee herself, designers, have found something very exciting, and they have actually sat down and read the book. And I think that is the success of a book, that once you start reading it, those who are even producing it with, you have certain semantics, you have a certain style guide, you have certain constraints and boxes. Even then, this book has been able to touch them, and I felt at the first level, that is our greatest success. Now, next level, the book is over to you, and we hope it does the same.
No, absolutely. I think I can vouch for that because the first few people in Penguin who read the book and engaged with it, and moving on to the publicity team, sales, anyone who has had a chance to go through the book really found it very interesting and revelatory in a way because, some people do believe that it is not easy to reach Aurobindo and he can be a little difficult to read, and we'll come to that a bit later. But I think that was a really good thing for us, and it sort of made our purpose more clear because the purpose of the book is to get in more readers and show Aurobindo into the lives of many more people, as many people as possible. So I hope this book is able to achieve that. Continuing with that idea, Devdip, how was it working with Gautam, on the book? Because it's a different kind of a book, it is an edited volume, it has a lot of contributors. How did you two go about it? And, if you have to describe the book in terms of the structure, how would you explain it?
Yeah, working with Gautam was very difficult. No, but jokes apart, no, it's been a wonderful collaborative process. It was actually during the pandemic in 2020 when Gautam and I started discussing the book. He had come to Pondicherry and we had a fairly long conversation about this. And as he mentioned, we realized very soon that this is something which is bigger than us, and we are only steering or guiding the process, but we have to align ourselves to something much larger which is taking place. And so we sat down and we started to identify who we could ask to write the different chapters. And we had a few criteria that we wanted to emphasize on. One, we wanted people from the ashram, but also people from outside. We wanted people from India, but also internationally. We wanted academics, but also people who are not academics, people who had engaged with the book regardless of whatever profession or careers that they were following. We wanted men and women. So we really wanted to present the books of Aurobindo through the prism of a variety of people. So not through any single lens. So that was really important for Gautam and I to identify people who could show that Aurobindo is accessible and is read by so many different people, regardless of whether they are academics or not. And that is really one of the ways by which we selected people. Some, of course, were not able to, they were not free. But eventually, we managed to get together 19 other contributors. So Gautam and I have around 7 chapters in the book, and then the other chapters were invited chapters. And working with Gautam, of course, is also very interesting because we have a very different perspective. Though we are rooted in the same philosophy and the same vision, Gautam comes from a world which engages, where he engages with politics and economy, and he lives in Delhi, in the heart of where all this is happening. And I'm quite ensconced in Pondicherry, in my teaching with my students and so on. So we also bring 2 different perspectives. And that has been an interesting dialogue and an interesting way by which we have been, we've worked together on this.
I think, Milee, you should just look at us as instruments rather than anything more glamorous than that. We are just the infrastructure, the pathways, the bridges. The real stuff is Sri Aurobindo. The real writers are those who contributed. We became the vehicles, and it's our privilege to be so, and nothing more.
You know, I was talking about Sri Aurobindo's writings and whether he is a difficult writer. So would you like to throw some light on that? Do you think he's
Absolutely.
complex? to read?
He's a very difficult writer, and he's a very simple writer. When you approach Sri Aurobindo the first time, you go to Sabda, and if you make the error of picking up the life divine, you will never read Sri Aurobindo. I assure you. Firstly, at a conceptual level, what Sri Aurobindo does is beyond what we are used to, even as Indians who are exposed to the Gita, Upanishads, Mahabharata, Puranas. Even we, in whom spirituality flows like a matter of fact, like the way we breathe, even us, we will find it difficult to read the life divine. And if God help you, if that's the first book you pick up. On the other hand, you pick up Vande Mataram, you pick up Karma Yogin, you pick up maybe letters on yoga, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you begin to get a little access, because these are the places where he writes about things that are familiar to us: freedom movement, sovereignty, patriotism, nationalism, and he brings spirituality, spiritual principles into it. The breadth of Sri Aurobindo, from politics to poetry to dramas to prose to analytics of, for instance, the Mahabharata, Kalidas, to spiritual principles, to scriptures like Upanishads, Gita, and so on, is humongous for any one human, any one being to do in one lifetime. He did it. From this library of width, then you get a depth, which is, be it patriotism, be it poetry, be it stories, he takes it into a deeper level that touches you inside. He takes you within yourself. And third, having done that, he takes it to a new height that we are not used to, as I talked about earlier. Put these together, and Sri Aurobindo is a very formidable writer. You need to, at one level, be extremely humble, at another level, be extremely strong to engage with these ideas. Having said that, this book, what we are trying to do here is that this gives you a taste. So 36 volumes, I think, from the beginning of this table to here, is about the physical size of the 36 volumes. All those have been encapsulated in 6 to 7 pages. Each volume is about 6 to 8 pages, depending on the... So this, we tried to make it a little familiar by people who know. So even the complex concepts, the complex language, we have tried to make it more introductory, give you a familiarization. I wouldn't like to call it an introduction to Sri Aurobindo, because that too is impossible to do. But we have tried to give you a familiarity with his writings, with his particular volumes. So whether it is tough or easy depends on you. There is no universal. A person may find Life Divine very easy to do, synthesis of yoga. Another may find it formidable, and he may find letters on yoga. So yes, he's a difficult writer, but once you get familiarized with the grammar of his spirituality, the principles, then I think it becomes easier and easier as you go forward.
I think, so I agree with Gautam that it's also a question of temperament. There are people who take directly to some of the more profound works, and they are able to absorb it. What I have found is that it is not a question of the knowledge of the language. Because even some very knowledgeable people who may be professors of English and so on find it very difficult to read Sri Aurobindo. And sometimes people with no background in literature or philosophy pick up and say that I'm drawing so much from the book. And so essentially each book of Sri Aurobindo contains his consciousness. an aspect of his consciousness. And if you are aligned to that, if there is an opening in you to that aspect that he's putting forth in the book, you resonate with it. And when a question was put to the mother on how one should read Sri Aurobindo, it was put by a student, her answer is very interesting. She says to read a little at a time, regularly, without thinking too much about what you're reading, to allow the words and the language to imprint themselves, to go deeper and affect the consciousness. And this is a very common experience with whoever reads Sri Aurobindo, that the reading changes you. And that the text can be read multiple times over the many years. So I teach, Milee, I teach one of the texts that I teach in the ashram college at the undergraduate level is called The Human Cycle, which is a social and political philosophical text. And I've been now engaged with that text for 3 years as a student, and then for 18 years as a teacher. And even now, every year I go back to the text with a new set of students, and I feel I'm as much a student as any of them. I feel like I'm learning with them as I'm reading the text. So it keeps giving, and that is what is really remarkable about Sri Aurobindo. I don't know if I could do this with too many other authors.
I just want to add one thing to what Devdip said. Sorry.
No, please go.
There is his magnum opus, Savitri. And I must have tried to read Savitri at least 35 times. And I have failed every time. I read 2 lines, 4 lines, half a stanza, maybe quarter of a canto, and I'm lost. And yet, what Devdip said, even in those few lines, when you approach Sri Aurobindo, you have to do it with the hermeneutics of respect rather than hermeneutics of skepticism. When you read those few lines, I definitely feel, and I've spoken to several in the ashram who also agree, that there is a presence. You feel these are living words. These are conscious words. They are mantric in their approach. You may not understand the mantra, but the mantra will understand you. And at a non-mental, psychic level, perhaps the mantra and you do talk to each other. That conversation does happen. And I think Sri Aurobindo's writings, if you approach it with a mantric, as though you're reading a mantra, then more than the mental, it becomes an integral reading. You read it with your body. You read it with your heart. You read it with your vital. And that integrality that he talks about is the integrality with which you surrender and read Sri Aurobindo. And that's, I think, so I may not remember Savitri's lines, but I know Savitri is here.
And one last thing, Milee, before we move on to the next question, because this is such a fundamental issue. At the same time, we have to engage with Sri Aurobindo when we read with the mind as well. Because he's writing for a readership that is not all. So he of course wrote a certain number of volumes and letters and so on to disciples. That is a different story altogether. But he wrote a number of volumes for a readership that was not necessarily his followers or his disciples. And there he's approaching us through the mind, through ideas, through thoughts. And we must rise up, if we need to rise up to the occasion, to engage with those ideas. And I think that's the reason why we feel this book is important, not just for our community and the ashram and the followers, but also because it's time for these ideas to gain engagement in the wider context. He speaks for humanity as a whole. And it is not just a deeper psychic reading, though that is fundamental, but there are also very interesting ideas that are essential for us to engage with.
No, absolutely. And that brings me, to my next question, which is on his core philosophy. So what, according to you, is the core philosophy of Sri Aurobindo, and how is it relevant, now in India, 75 years after independence?
So, Sri Aurobindo's teaching starts from that of the ancient sages, where there is an ultimate reality, a fundamental truth of existence which is separated from us by a veil of ignorance, by uh, by a lack of our ability to see that greater reality which surrounds us and which is the truth of things. So with that, in that respect, to arrive at that self, at that higher consciousness, at that ultimate truth, in this respect, it is the same as the teachings that have come down to us for thousands of years. Where it is unique is he brings in an evolutionary aspect where he says the purpose of nature, the purpose of humanity is not to stop at where we are, but to rise to a greater consciousness. And having arrived at that greater truth or that greater consciousness above, to be able to bring it down and to make it act upon the nature, to transform the mind, the vital, the feelings, the emotions, right down to the physical consciousness. The method of doing that, of course, it is a complex, he himself says, it is not easy, it is a difficult and long endeavor. And he makes use of the methods of the past, but he is not bound by any specific method or any specific practice. He takes up the different yogas of the past, but then turns them to an end which has perhaps not been expressed or seen in this way, this total transformation of the individual and of the collective society. So that is the sort of core, you can say, philosophical approach of Sri Aurobindo. And of course, there are some more things that one could say. For example, he says to discover the soul within, to rise up beyond the mind to these higher planes that exist, to bring that down into oneself. So there is a whole methodology. But what is interesting is that it fits in, this is not just an individual philosophical worldview, perspective. It fits into humanity as a whole, collective evolution, growth, history. All of these aspects become illuminated and seen differently when we put consciousness in the center. When we put consciousness in the middle, it changes the way that we understand ourselves and the world. And I think maybe Gautam might want to say something about consciousness in terms of how you were mentioning to me yesterday, how the word, fundamentally altered your perspective when you thought about consciousness.
Okay, so I've forgotten that conversation, sorry. but I want to add to your, the basic principles, according to me.
We will revisit that,
Is that I think he sees man as a transitional being. So from the ape to the man, the jump that happened, that same consciousness is now going to take us to the next level. And that next level of evolution, which is a primary core principle. What was the word you used? Core philosophy of Sri Aurobindo is, in fact, not the dissolution of the body or a dissolution of consciousness into the spirit above, but to call that down and change it in our body. The very cells of our body matter. And I think there lies a lot of science and spirituality and the bridge that he has been able to build, which takes Indian spiritual and philosophical traditions to the next level, where it doesn't stop at dissolution, but it comes down back to earth, back into our cells, and transforms them. That's one thing which I wanted to add.
Yeah, but the second part of my question.
We've hardly started.
Well, I had lots more questions myself, and what I really wanted to do was to open the floor for some questions. So, one last question, which okay, there's some miscalculation, so we will continue.
So how much time do we have actually? Then we'll accordingly plan the session. Okay.
How many minutes? Oh, okay. So I think we have, 30 minutes or so, as per my calculations. So no problem.
Half an hour.
Yes.
Okay, good.
So my calculation was right. I think we will continue. And the second part of my question was about Sri Aurobindo's relevance, now in India, 75 years after independence. And either of you can take that, or both of you.
To say that Sri Aurobindo is relevant in the 21st century or in the 75th Independence Day is reducing Sri Aurobindo into a box that into a bullet point. I think Sri Aurobindo always has been relevant, but just to emphasize further, I think the world today, if you look at it across geographies, there is a disunity which is driving the world. There is a separateness which is creating fissures, conflicts. And when he spoke of, for instance, the ideal of human unity, it wasn't, or the human cycle, it wasn't about just setting up new institutions. For instance, the concert of Europe being replaced with the next organization, which again failed, and now we have a United Nations, which again is failing, and it will continue to fail until we understand the spiritual unity that binds humanity together. So in that aspect, I would say, Sri Aurobindo, nothing is more relevant today for any peace-seeking individual and a peace-desiring economy or a sovereign or a government or a country or a geography than to read Sri Aurobindo today and understand that this separateness is an artificial barrier which has to be overcome. It is important, it has its place, but it is not, we cannot continue with this anymore. On economy, he has a lot to say. For instance, what are the incentives? For instance, self-confidence. It's not just putting money together. I think he just didn't believe in the state doing business. And we are seeing a lot of that in India, and much of which is now going back, thank you. And we are glad to see that happen. But there are also the forces that want in more nationalization, etc. And I think they need to read Sri Aurobindo's chapter in early cultural writings, which is actually a speech that he wrote for the King of Baroda. I can continue to talk about tiny relevances, but I don't want to get trapped into bullet points. I think the biggest relevance, or biggest, if we want to take something, is that when he talks about war, for instance, he was writing about war. He says, and there was some peace. So he said, peace is temporary. As long as the stimulus for war remains within, wars will continue. And I think if we really want to seek peace, if we want harmony, if we want a planetary unity, I think it is this harmony within ourselves as individuals, then as a collective, then as a nation, and then as a planet that we need to seek out. And I think, so he writes a lot about the practical aspects of war, outer world, culture, education, and so on, each of which is driven by the conversations within. I think that is what makes it.
I think when we speak of the 150th, it's of course an important marker because it allows us to engage once again with his ideas and read his books and to have these conversations that we are having. But in a certain sense, his is also an eternal birth. And what I mean by that is that there is a fundamental truth which obviously we understand through his life and his work, but it is something which is a progressive, constantly evolving reality. So sometimes I get asked the question, 75 years have passed. Where are the changes that Sri Aurobindo speaks about? How do we see society or the world reflecting those changes? And what I like to highlight is that if we imagine that we will see newspaper articles saying the world is now transforming or there is now change of consciousness is happening, it is of course very futile to have that expectation. But if we look carefully, if we see with a little subtlety, we find, for example, education. Major movements of education around the world people are asking the questions about what is the purpose? How do we address the child as a being rather than as someone who has to be fed information? And these ideas are even coming into the mainstream. It is no longer something which is happening in remote enclaves. If you look at the idea today about spirituality, if you say that life and spirituality are not separate from each other, no one bats an eyelid. Even people in various other traditions or orders, because it's something that is more and more accepted as a truth, that somehow intuitively you feel they have to somehow come together. You cannot keep them divided anymore. And similarly, if you look at patterns in the world, I feel that you will find that whether people attribute it to Sri Aurobindo or not is irrelevant, but the changes that he speaks about, the changes of consciousness taking place, are certainly present and active. And so this is a good time, a good moment for us to sort of rededicate ourselves to those ideals.
Just 1 second. So
Sure.
just to illustrate, because these concepts can get very abstract. He talked about education, and the kind of education that we do, let's say, is a field, a subject, a group of subjects, intersectionality and other jargons that are being spewed out. But in fact, education, the way Sri Aurobindo sees it, and which is something that India must lead through policy, is the complete integral education of the mind, of the emotions, to managing your emotions, the physical, all at an integral level. And we don't even think about it. Let's take the mind. Is stuffing information or analyzing information about a particular field, let's talk about, let's say, physics, a goal of education? Is a job a goal of education? In the mind alone, he talks about how concentration, the very principles, the substance of education, of a being, of a child, of an individual grown up, is not limited to just knowing more, reading more, being aware more, better informed in the information age, more knowledgeable in the knowledge society. It's also an inward looking, to be able to concentrate, to be calm, all these parts. So I think this education itself, it's not to change the texture of a field or a texture or reorganize information. It is also the soul of education that he talks about, and which is missing in all across the world, and sadly even in India.
No, absolutely. And there is so much else. But I'll take one last question and then open the floor for audience questions. When you look at Sri Aurobindo's life and his work, you definitely encounter the mother, and her contribution. So who and what is the mother? Devdip, you go first.
Well, in a certain sense, it's very hard to even look at them as two separate entities, because one without the other is inconceivable in a certain sense. In the context of reading Sri Aurobindo, I think a lot of people find a lot of help in approaching the mother, because the mother did not write much, though she has a lot of correspondence and a few very important essays, but her conversations and her classes with the children have all been recorded, children and also the ashramites. And so through these conversations, we get an approach into the same vision, the same consciousness, but in a language that is more accessible and also much more focused on the practice rather than merely the principles. And so, in fact, in the conclusion of the book, where we talk about some suggestions and we give some sort of a little guidance as to how the reader can continue their journey with reading the texts, we refer to the mother and we say, reading her is often a very direct path to the same perspective. And maybe Gautam wants to add a little bit about the mother.
Yeah, so reading Sri Aurobindo is very difficult. So the first, if you find that difficult, you should try to read the mother. If you find reading mother difficult, read our book. She also has, how much? 37 volumes.
No. 18
volumes.
18
So
volumes.
if you think 18 volumes are formidable, maybe this small little volume will work for you.
I mean, yes, and of course, jokes apart, I mean, the mother was you asked who was the mother, and she's the one who really manifests Sri Aurobindo's vision. In practical terms, you can think about the ashram wouldn't exist without her. The ashram school wouldn't exist without her. Auroville, the founding of Auroville. These are important outer legacies. And there is, of course, an entire domain which we can only sort of understand from a distance, a little ignorantly, is all the work that she did to bring down what Sri Aurobindo was represented into the world and sort of anchoring it in the world. And there's a whole volume on the mother and letters on the mother. And for those who are interested in further exploring, that is a text that they should definitely read.
Yeah, so if Sri Aurobindo, he drew the contours of integral yoga, of evolution, Mother manifested it using the ashram as a laboratory. I think that would encapsulate.
I think you explained it beautifully. And now I'm going to open the floor for questions. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand and we'll get the mic to you. The gentleman at the back, can we pass him the mic, please?
So while we are waiting for the mic to get there, I just want to highlight once again, I just see some more of our authors are here. So there is Richard Hart's right in the front, and I'm just pointing it out so that in case people want to discuss with them later on or catch them, you know where to go. Richard has contributed 4 chapters, and he's also one of the editors of the complete works of Sri Aurobindo. So we were really happy to have Richard as part of our project, and we are both in awe of his scholarship and his learning, and we have definitely been helped by his direct involvement. There is Dr. Samparananda Mishra, who has contributed a chapter on the writings in Bengali and Sanskrit, and he's an authority in the field of Sanskrit. And I also see one of our younger authors at the back, Anshul Sinha, who was, I'm happy to say, very proud to say, also a student of mine. And Anshul has done his studies in philosophy, and he's written the chapter on the Kena Upanishad. And so to highlight what I had said earlier, that we wanted to select a range of writers across age groups, across backgrounds, from different perspectives, so that really the book is a representative of the kind of reading that happens around Sri Aurobindo's works. So just with that, I hope I've not missed anyone. If there is any other contributor in the audience, please lift up your hand, because that's all I can see at the moment. But now we can take the questions.
No, good morning. Namaste. My name is Srinivas, and I'm a student of yoga. So it seems that Sri Aurobindo's writings on yoga are predominantly in English. I have not read much of his, but whatever I've seen of his brilliant poetry, and they are therefore framed for a Western audience. For example, employing keywords like vital, mental, intellectual, etc., instead of what we would call today in the resurgent Indic consciousness as, say, the Pranamaya Kosha, Manomaya Kosha, Vijnanamaya Kosha, etc., which are all found in the Taittiriya Upanishad. So, is it the case that there has been more emphasis on that particular way of looking at yoga so as to translate it for a broader international audience? And therefore, does this create somewhat of a disconnect from the source materials? Because all this is found in the Taittiriya Upanishads.
Very good question. That's a very, very good question. Thank you. No, I don't think it's anything to do with Indians or foreigners or reaching out here and there. English was his language. That's the language he wrote in. That's the language he used. But I think in your question lies a source of future actions. I think we need to get his works translated into as many languages as possible. Let me give an example. In 1960, the critical edition of the Mahabharata got completed under the editorship of Sukthankar. Since then, these are huge. I don't want to get into how they were put together, but the critical edition itself is an adventure. Now, after that, there is a whole new awakening awaited in India through the translations of the critical edition. Likewise, I would say that the complete works of Sri Aurobindo the last book came out in 2017, Richard?
2019, I think.
2019. The last book came out in 2019 of his complete, of the complete works of Sri Aurobindo. Perhaps it's now time to start translating his works into other languages.
I just want to add to that. One is that he actually uses a lot of Sanskrit terms. If you were to read the Life Divine and a number of other texts, he is frequently employing Sanskrit terms. In fact, to kind of switch the question, he was asked by another disciple in the 1930s, exactly the reverse question: is your teaching for Hindus? You are using so many terms in Sanskrit. This was asked by a Muslim disciple. And Sri Aurobindo says something interesting. He says, if I was familiar, if there was a different context, if I was familiar with the Sufi terms, I might use them as well. Ultimately, the only thing that matters is the principle in question, regardless of the language. And English certainly universalizes Sri Aurobindo, not just for the world at large, but also for Indians. Because the fact is, if he had written in any one Indian language, it would be limiting, much more than it is to write in English. Let us be honest. If there is something that can be read across the states of India, across different cities, it would be in English today. Even Hindi does not have that universal reach that English has in India today. So this is not to say that it is only for an English audience. I agree with Gautam fully. We must translate. We must make it accessible to whoever wants to read.
Thank you. Any other questions? Please raise your hand. Oh.
Yeah, I have read less of Aurobindo. My question is regarding that supramental consciousness evolving into a superior species. Actually, this question is partly to Dr. Parikshit because he spoke about comparing with Nietzsche's Superman. As an individual level, yes, it might happen or it may happen after a few centuries, but there is a saying or some thoughts like the end of the consequence of Nietzsche's Superman was people like Lenin, Stalin and Mao, or recently maybe even Osama, we can say. So is there a need to down-emphasize that part of Aurobindo's thoughts because it may end up in a different, or it is prone to misinterpret in that way, only based on the power which Nietzsche proposed. I think it may be still applicable at the individual level. An individual may evolve better or a group may evolve maybe a few centuries. I hope I got my question right. Sorry.
Sir, the universal fact is that the higher the truth, the greater the danger of misinterpreting and falsifying it. So, because something can be misinterpreted or can turn into its opposite is not a reason not to aspire towards it. The supramental, once you understand firstly, we are in no position to discuss and talk about the supramental consciousness because we are nowhere near it as individuals. So our understanding is very, very secondary. But if you were to read Sri Aurobindo and see how he places it in the context of his evolutionary world vision, it becomes evident that it is the logical next step. And certainly, to speak about the supramental consciousness or the supramentalization of the body, before we have even taken the first elementary steps of spiritual realization and knowledge is foolhardy. So that should certainly not be encouraged, and we should, not have the illusion that we are getting there anytime soon. But having said that, I do not agree with the idea that we should leave it to the side or somehow downplay it, because that is the fundamental role of Sri Aurobindo. In fact, in the book, and I'm really so glad, I have to point out here that we were so happy to work with Milee as the publisher from Penguin. At no point were we told, oh, these are not mainstream ideas, you should, maybe tone it down, or don't talk about these things. We were given a free hand to bring out Sri Aurobindo in the way that he writes about his way of looking at things. Which is why in the book, if you open the jacket of the book, the very first thing that you will see right over here is an introduction to the writings of Sri Aurobindo, the supramental sage. That is also the title of the introduction that Gautam has written. And we want to put it out there that that is what Sri Aurobindo represents, the supramental sage. Afterwards, I agree with you, sir, that we should not harbor any misconceived notion that we are rapidly achieving that goal, but we must keep it in view.
Before we take the next question, in the interest of time, we request you to limit the duration of your question to 30 seconds, please.
Okay, I'll be quick.
Sure.
Gautam, when you just started the introduction, you spoke about the life divine, and it kind of seems forbidding, but in your book, have you touched about his humor? Because Sri Aurobindo's aspect, that humorous aspect, is very much part of him.
So, I think there is a separate book to be written on issues like humor, his spirituality, his philosophical approach, his patriotism, his freedom fighting, and so on and so forth. This book is a familiarization exercise of each of the 36 volumes. Actually, some volumes combine, let's say, 31 books. Because some books are across 2 volumes and there are 3 books in a single volume and so on. We are trying to give you a familiarization of what he wrote across 31 books or chapters that we have done. So I think there is a great idea lying here in what you say, and I think that idea has been explored by some other devotees and disciples. Because I've read somewhere in some of those Sabda books about his. But in this book, we have not frontally talked about his humor, although at certain points we have referred to it.
Maybe when we letters on yoga, there might be some reference to it, but not,
If that aspect is just gently woven, that's all.
Hopefully, the person who worked on letters on yoga brought it out. I think they did. Yeah.
But you've certainly given them idea for a new book. So thank you so much. I think we have time for one last question and then we'll wrap up.
This is a specific question about what he terms as the Muslim problem. So from his writings, we get an impression that he just viewed it as more of a nationalistic and political issue rather than a civilizational conflict. So can you comment on this? So what was Sri Aurobindo's view on the Muslim problem?
Who wants to take it? Okay, Devdip first.
So there are a few references where he takes up this issue. We do find him discussing this issue in his talks, which are not his own writings, but recordings noted by other people. I think a very important source that we can go to is his 15th August message, 1947, where he also addresses this. And he says that if we do not resolve this, if we are not able to arrive at a resolution to this fundamental conflict, it will not only weaken Indian society, but open the door to a possible invasion even. And so for him, whether it's a civilizational conflict or a political conflict, the fact is that he emphasized the essential unity of India. He emphasized the essential Indianness that must permeate and grow in our hearts and minds. And this is, of course, a subject for a much longer discussion. But in his mind, certainly, the view was that we must transcend these limitations, find that source of unity, of Indianness, which is in our hearts and souls, and stress upon that above everything else. And if we are able to reach there, then these problems would find their natural resolution. And if we are not able to address it, and if we descend into conflict and division and violence, he is very clear that the future of India is in question.
Would you like to add something to that, Gautam? Yeah.
No, nothing to add to that, but I just, since we are closing and there is a threat of that bell ringing to throw, before we are thrown out here, I just wanted to, make one small appeal. This book, reading Sri Aurobindo, is not the last word. So don't look at it as the way it is. It is the first word. I think Sri Aurobindo has been systematically and ruthlessly cancelled by India, by Indian academia, by Indian mainstream. In his 150th birth anniversary, we are trying to rejuvenate something that is core to India. The core, what India stands for, what Bharat Varsha is, what Indian culture is, how India should move forward, and then expand that to a level of humanity. All of you reading this book, we will be very grateful for all that you write to us. But I think the final, what will give us success, how I will determine success, and it may not be sales, Milee, so don't I'm sorry about that, is that
Reading is sales.
if this book can ignite 100 PhDs on various aspects of Sri Aurobindo, including the Muslim question, the Indian language question, I'm forgetting any question that bothers the jokes, the humor of Sri Aurobindo. I think that's where Sri Aurobindo, India needs to rediscover and reclaim Sri Aurobindo into our day-to-day narratives. I think all those who are fighting these civilizational wars and this divisions of society and the science of consciousness and so on, please, you have a treasure trove in these 36 volumes. Go through this book, read the troves, do your own research. Let 1,000 books span on Sri Aurobindo.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Devdip, Gautam, and to all of you for being here. We will leave with some last words. All right. So I think now we are seeing a lot of kindness from the organizers. I think we have a couple of minutes, so we
If
will
there's
close
another
with
question, we can take another question if there is another question.
one last question. If anyone, okay, that lady at the back, please.
I already read Swami Vivekananda, so is there a need to read Sri Aurobindo also? Seems like they both say similar things.
Devdip.
As far as the Indian spiritual and philosophical traditions go, both Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo are on the same plane. But I think if you read Sri Aurobindo, he takes that to the next level, which it will be a process of discovery for you once you start reading his primary works.
And Penguin publishes both. We have a book on Sri Vivekananda also, so please go ahead and read that too.
And actually, madam, there is no need to. If you feel called to read, and if you feel that there is something that you would like to discover and learn, then you should approach it. But it's fine. It is not a competition. They are all different approaches to the spirit. But certainly, I agree with Gautam when he says that Sri Aurobindo articulates a vision that is not only of the past and its glory and its beauty, but also something which fundamentally flows into the future. And each, tradition approaches this truth in its own different ways. But if you are eager for knowledge, if you're curious to know more, then certainly you will gain from that reading.
And Sri Aurobindo has written on Vivekananda. So if you have read Vivekananda, you will be delighted to know Sri Aurobindo has talked about Vivekananda in some of his letters.
Actually, I just had another question in my mind. You said Sri Aurobindo is not recognized or rejected by the academia But why didn't the same thing happen with Swami Vivekananda? I find them to be so similar in whatever they say. We celebrate Swami Vivekananda, but by going by what you said, that Sri Aurobindo was not accepted by the academy and others. Why is that the case?
So I haven't studied Vivekanand as deeply as I have. I'm familiar with his works, I'm familiar with his writings, I have read his complete works, but I have not studied Vivekanand the way I have studied Sri Aurobindo. So I don't know what the extent of his entry into academia is or not. All I speak for is Sri Aurobindo, and Sri Aurobindo has been cancelled.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing to what you said, Gautam, that you mentioned about hopefully you can, there are 100 PhDs and so on, and I think that's important. But I think, both of us are equally happy if you're just reading. It's not even that there is a necessity for an academic publication or whatever else, but that there is an access to the works. And we feel in the 150th anniversary, 75 years of independence, that somehow the time has emerged, the time has come for his works to have wider engagement.
And we are extremely grateful, therefore, to take that the Sri Aurobindo Ashram, through its editors, has put out the complete works of Sri Aurobindo online, free of cost, ready to be downloaded and read. It's a great public service that has happened.
No, absolutely. I'd like to thank our panelists, editors, Gautam and Devdip, and all our contributors who are here, who are also not here. So thank you for being here. You've been a wonderful audience. We will end now, but I'll request our authors to hold a copy of the book for you before we wrap this up.
This is not a launch. Please don't read it as such. The launch has happened already. This book has got the blessings of Sri Aurobindo 2 days ago. So we are just a discussion. It was sent to his room, and it has received those blessings.